Okay, welcome to this Substance Pack tutorial. This is my pre-intro, which I do after I've done everything. So what we're going to do is make this chair. Well, not the chair, we're going to make the texture for this chair. And we're going to essentially end up with two textures. We'll end up with this messed up one, which has got rust and dirt and all sorts of things. But we'll also, or initially rather, just build up this rather clean out of the showroom version. So it's going to take us a little time, but we're going to learn a bit about some masks and effects and blending things together. And yeah, I hope you find it really useful. So I'll get started now. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we're going to do today is do a kind of complete project in one video, unlike the smaller videos that I've done previously. And we're going to texture up a chair, but the chair is going to have different zones on it. There's going to be kind of a leather zone on it, and there'll be a metal zone on it, and we're going to divide those up within one material set or one texture set. So let's get going by close there and file and new. I'm using the PBR Metallic Rough Alpha Blend template, and if I go select, I'm going to pick my model up. I'm going to set the size to 2048 and my normal map format to DirectX. If you want to use OpenGL, feel free. Depends what you're using it for. And then click OK. Okay, so what I'm going to do is separate this into two zones, one for metal and one for leather, so that, you know, it doesn't look weird. So I'm going to delete this layer, add two folders. So we'll call the top one metal and we'll call the bottom one leather. There we go. And we can now drop a couple of textures on here. It won't be perfect to start with, but we're going to mask it so that it works nicely. So if I drag the aluminium onto the metal, you'll see it all turns lovely and metallic in a moment or two. And I'm going to start with a plastic base for the plastic mat for the leather, and I'll drag that onto the leather folder. And you'll notice you can't see any of the blue because the metal is on everything and it's the top of the stack, so it's overwriting everything else. So what we can do is add a black map or black mask to here, which reveals everything, and then using the polygon fill here, we can define which bits are going to be metal. So I'm going to select down here. Actually, I'm going to go onto the model fill here, the mesh fill, and if I just drag a little box over those metal pieces, it will add them to my mask. See, I accidentally added a bit more there than I wanted to. So I just used Control Z to go backwards a little bit. You have to be careful not to select through too much on these. That's why I'm kind of zooming in a bit and picking my angles. Okay, so that's all the metal pieces. And next we want to pick the leather. Now I don't have to pick every single little bit of leather. What we can do is take our metal mask and flip it. So if I right click and copy mask, which is down here, and then on the leather layer, on the leather folder, I can right click and paste into mask, and that will add the same mask. And now it looks wrong because again it's still trying to put it over the metal, but if I right click and invert the mask, it will go just where we want it to go. There we are. Okay, so in the next video, what I'm going to do before I add any kind of effects and things to this, we're going to bake some maps out to, you know, help us in our texturing process. Okay, so I've just switched to the 3D only view, just to give myself a little bit of space. And now we're going to bake our maps out. So under the texture set settings, on this little box with the cross through it, we've got our mesh maps. So they should all be empty at the moment. And just pay attention to what this leather looks like currently. It's okay, but it's, you know, flat, boring. So when I bake the mesh maps, let me just activate the ones I deactivated in practice. I deactivate ID, and ambient occlusion I've set to 256 rays, and the minimum occlusion distance I've set to halfway down the scale. And similar on curvature, I've gone to 256 rays, sampling radius at halfway along the scale. And then I can bake out my texture maps. And this should take a moment or two, depending upon your machine. And when it's done, we have our maps. And it should have some sort of difference immediately. I could see that my blue is still sort of quite plain blue, except in certain places it's actually more defined. If I turn off the occlusion map, for example, you should see that it's all gone very bright. And then if I rebake that, let's just turn off the other ones to save time, and you'll see now around the areas where, you know, the map is, or the model is occluding itself, and in the crevices it's gone darker, a bit more muted. So it's already doing something for us. But the main thing they do for us is drive functions and generators, and enables us to you know, add effects to our texturing that otherwise would take probably a reasonable amount of time to recreate. So what we'll do in the next section is we'll start to build up the surface of this leather and set the colours such that, you know, it's not blue and it's got some surface irregularities to it. Okay, so I will talk to you then. Right, so what we want to do now, sorry about that, I had to minimise for some reason, is to start to colour our leather. We're going to go for a blackish kind of grey leather. So first thing I'm going to do is just change my base colour down to a dark grey. Not black, because black isn't one of those PBR safe colours. It tends to throw issues. So near black, but not black. And it already looks more like a nice posh chair. But what I want to do is add some effects to this. I want to add some surface texture, and I want to add some variation in how shiny this model is. So for that we need a new layer. So I'm going to go to the layers tab and add a new layer above my plastic map. I'll just call this leather base for the moment. Leather, John, not letter. There we go. So with it selected, I'll add a new fill layer which will completely overwrite it. But what I want here is I don't want any colour. Okay, and I don't really want any metallic or opacity or emissive or anything like that. So I'll turn off those two. And I'm also going to turn off the normal. So all we're affecting is the height of our surface and how rough it is. And so if I turn this right up somewhere about half, and I increase the height by a small amount, say 0.03, you won't really see anything happening because there's nothing. It's all completely overwriting the underlying layer. So again, we need a black mask to merge and kind of blend between the two. So let's add a black mask. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. So we've added a black mask, and then I'm going to add in a generator. So this generator is empty at the moment, but we can pick from a number of generators with different effects. So for this one I'm going to pick dirt out, and that's going to put a fine layer across everything. To see the mask and see where it's going to be merging, I'm going to go to the mask view, and there we can see it. So you can see the white is where it's going to show on this layer, the black is where it will show for the layer below. So this is going into the crevices, which is quite good. That's where I'd want, you know, some dirt to end up. But it's also got like a general over the entire mesh. So each generator has its own kind of set of parameters which you can adjust. So for example, we can really reduce the dirt level. You could take the effect of this down quite far, and we could take the contrast. So if I take the contrast all the way to 0, it's going to be a very kind of gradiated map. There's going to be lots of levels of grey. Whereas if I go right to the other end, you'll see it's very sharp. It's black or it's white. So just adjust that to your liking. I think somewhere around there. I want some bits which are pure black, and I want some bits that are pure white, but I don't want, you know, I don't want it to be too stark. Okay, so what else have we got? We have the grunge amount and the grunge scale. So if I turn the grunge amount off, you'll see it's only applying to the bits where the map is occluded, where the ambient occlusion is within our maps. But if I increase it, you'll see that it starts then to put a noise over everything, just to spread it out. So I'm going to increase that, and the grunge scale is essentially the size of the texture, the grunge texture it's using. If I turn it right up, you're likely to see that it starts to repeat itself, and you might see some repeating patterns because it's essentially tiling. So it comes in tiled at 4, but I'll often turn it down a little smaller than that. I think 2 is good in this particular case. Okay, you might notice also that it seems to be cascading over to the other texture, the metal texture. It's not, because the mask above it on the folder will block it out. Okay, so let's go and have a look at our material. There we go. And now if I zoom in a little, we should see, if I can get the light to work right, that it's not all smooth and it's not all the same, you know, level of shininess. If I go to the actual layer itself and increase the height, you'll see what the height's doing. That's why I've used a very small amount. Actually, I've gone that way. I might actually go the other way to make it negative. So negative 0.01. No, that's not enough. Let's try 3. There we go. We have a little bit of a variation going on there. And the roughness difference I don't think is enough either. So if I really increase the roughness, then we should get a much different kind of shine between the two. And if I turn the roughness down on the main or the base, then, you know, that will shine, the other bits will be duller, and, you know, it's starting to look a bit more like leather. Okay, so that looks okay, nothing particularly sort of thrilling or exciting. What we'll do in the next section is just enhance this a little further to add a little bit more detail to it. So I'll talk to you after my break. Okay, so I'm back again, and this time we're going to add some, just a few cracks to this. So we'll add in a new fill layer, and again I'm going to add a black mask to it, and this time we're going height only. So let's turn off all of these. I might put rough back in again in a moment or two actually, and colour, but let's start with this. And this time we're not going to use a generator, we're just going to use a texture. So in my textures, I'm going to just delete my folder out there. There's a few bits and bobs in here that I could use. I think a marble perhaps. So I'm looking for a marble that's not too extreme, but I do want it to be, you know, quite streaky, if that makes sense. So let's have a look. What have I got? Marble wide and marble fine. I think marble fine will do us just nicely. So I'll drag that onto my height, and I'm going to change this to the height map so that it's easier to see. And I can't see that it's doing anything at all. So let's have a look at its settings. I've had this before actually, when I've put a height in and it's not actually done anything. So let's change the way this works. Well, actually no, I know exactly why I didn't do anything. I put it in the wrong place. I do apologise. So in my fill layer I need to add a fill, and then I can add my marble to that fill. There we go. Now we can see these little cracks going on. Now they might be a bit big or they might be too small, it depends upon what you want, but I think they're a bit too big, so I'm going to change my scale, essentially my what's the word I'm looking for, UV tiling, to 2. And then also under here, a lot of these textures, you know, calling it a texture is a little bit, how can I put it, a little bit too basic for it. It's not an image, it's a function, it's a, you know, it has parameters. So in this one we've got balance and contrast. So as before, the more I turn my contrast up, the sharper my lines will get. So I want them to be a bit sharper and a bit darker. So I'm just going to turn that balance up quite far. There we go. And when we go back to our material view and zoom in, nothing is visible just yet because on the texture I haven't changed the height parameter. So if I change the height parameter now, you'll see that it starts to actually come in. And this is why I said I might change the colour and rough earlier, because on the rough, if I make it ultimately rough, now underneath there is very, very, you know, rough. It's not shiny at all. And if I add in my colour, I can take this down to a slightly lighter grey to indicate that the actual, you know, cover has been removed. You know, the layer of polish and, you know, so on that you get on these things is started to be taken off. You could either do it in, you know, a real, you know, sort of light brown leathery colour. So have a look around, see what you think, see whether, you know, it's something that you like. But then, you know, I think it's okay, but I think in places it needs to be dialed down a bit. In some places I think it's fine, in other places I think it could do with actually being, you know, a little lighter. So what we can do for that is in our layer, in our mask here, we can add another function on top of this. So if I right click there, we could either add a fill or a, you know, or a generator. I'm going to add a fill, and then we could take another layer and put it over the top. So I'm going to go in here and find some noise, and I think we'll use something quite sparse, perhaps this Gaussian spots, and pop that on there. Now currently this is replacing completely everything underneath it, and if I go to the mask you'll see that that is the case. But what we can do is change the way these interact by changing the layer blend. So if I change that to for example multiply, you'll see that some of our cracks now are faded and not quite so prominent. We could also change the scale of this. So if I change this to 2, we'll get a slightly different effect. If I take it down, we'll get a different effect again. And I think that's the one I want. I want it to be less. Yeah, I want it there to be bigger kind of gaps and bigger fades between the two. If you're not happy with the way it's blending, you can change your type just to see, what it looks like, just to give you an idea of how it goes. Let's try subtract. No. Maybe add. No, definitely not. So I'm going to stick with multiply. But if it's too strong, you can take the blend down so that it's not completely obliterating what you've got underneath. There we go. So let's go back and have a look at our material. And as we say, we've still got our cracks there. They're still, working quite well, but they're not as, uniform. They're not as spread as our previous option. Okay, so I think for the moment I've got enough on my leather. We will come back a little bit when we do like a complete over texture on both zones, but next, when I come back after my little pause, we'll add in some detail to the metal. Okay, so I will talk to you then. Okay, so let's have a look at our metal. So our metal's very plain and clean and lovely at the minute, but I want to add some interest to it. So to start with, I'm just going to duplicate this layer. So it's right click, duplicate layer, and I'm going to take my colour and darken it a little, and I'm going to increase the roughness. So this is going to form like a dirtier, kind of rougher layer. So what we need to do is mask it so that we can blend them together as we have before, but this time we're going to build our own little generator. So instead of using one of the preset ones, we're going to create our own. And the reason we're going to do that is the preset ones use maps in a kind of specific way, and some of them let you control it and some of them don't. In this case, I don't want any real ambient occlusion in my mask because there's a lot in this particular area. So where did I get to? So add black mask, add generator, and then we're going to pick from the list the mask editor. So as soon as I put that on, it will basically turn curvature on, and if I go to the mask view, you'll see what it's doing. So we've got some very white areas, we've got some very dark areas, and it's not really that suitable. But what we could do, and I do just want to use curvature in this case, is turn curvature right up, but then adjust the parameters within curvature. So in this case, I only want really the very small details to be included. But to demonstrate, I'm going to take all the details and put them down to 0 until I have nothing happening. So if I pick the huge details, you'll see just about everything adds in. It's way too much. Similarly with big and large and medium and soft, a bit better, and then fine, even better. But in this case, essentially, I want mostly sharp, which is going to be the very edges. And then I'm going to add to that a little bit of fine, just to spread it out a little bit. Okay, so that gives us real control over where our effect from our generator is going to be. But it's very plain. It's very kind of precise in terms of what it's doing and where it's doing it. So what we can do in a mask editor is use image inputs. So these images are all, you know, from the bake, but we have two texture images that we can use. So I'm just going to use the top one to start with. So I can drag in from that any of our pieces here, and I think I might pick a fur, oddly enough, and drag that into it. Now you'll see nothing happens initially because there's nothing happening. We haven't told it what to do. We haven't told it how to behave. So if we go to the top, you'll see there's a texture option and texture opacity, and now you'll see that fur is blending with our curvature map to give us an effect. And if you open up the texture options there, we have things we can change. So I can make them much finer by increasing my scale. We can invert it if we want to. It's quite nice actually, I like the inverted version. We can change the contrast between the two, so you know, the whites become whiter and the darks become darker, and we can change the brightness. I think the brightness was okay somewhere where it was. So I've got some kind of really fine scratches here on the edges and a little bit on the faces, but not as much because, you know, our curvature is preventing it from going there. So I'm going to turn this up even further, just to see how fine I can get it. Okay. We could turn on triplanar, and triplanar has a real effect on scale, so I'm going to take that back a bit if I use triplanar. And triplanar will basically project it from all sides and you know, at least minimize issues with seams. But I'm going to turn that off and turn my scaling right up. And non-square tiling, that's on true, that seems to be reasonable. And of course I can overall affect how that's blending with the texture opacity. So let's go and see what effect that's had on our overall material. And now we've got some very kind of fine and reasonably subtle kind of scratch variations in our piece. And if I go here and, you know, really darken it up, you'll get a much better idea of what's happening. And you know, it's a question of you know, what you want and what your taste is. You know, if you want it really in your face, then really make it dark, and if you want it more subtle, then, you know, lighten it up. Where am I? Base color. So I'm going to get it to a point where it's kind of just there, and quite often I'll turn the layer off and on again to see the overall effect, because sometimes you can make it so subtle that it's hard to tell until you turn it off, and then you see the difference. I hope that makes some sense. Well, yeah, should do. So I'm just going to increase the roughness on that a little bit. There we go. And that should see you know, variation in shine, you know, from at least a distance. Perhaps not that rough. There we go. Okay, so that's a little bit you know, on the metal. When I come back from my little pause, I'm going to use a position gradient to darken up and just roughen the feet down here. Okay, so I will talk to you then. Okay, so what I want to do now is put some variation on the feet where they've been sitting on the floor and have got a bit roughed up maybe. So what I'm going to do for that is take a copy of my layer here, and this is my, I don't know, scratch, if I can remember how to spell. So let's duplicate this layer, and then I'm going to darken it up again and increase my roughness, and then I'm going to select this editor and just delete it. So now we have nothing, and then we'll add in that generator back. So let's have the mask editor, and this time I don't want any curvature, I just want to look at a position gradient. So let's change to mask and then have a look at the position. So the position gradient is here. We have lots of options in it, but essentially what I want to look at is the up down option, which is the default. So you'll notice that that gives me it's very white at the top and it's very dark at the bottom. It's come the wrong way around, but we can deal with that. So if I open up the position gradient, I can just look down to the top bottom, which you can see is 1, it's maxed, and we have a couple of options here. So I can invert it to start with, but then it's going too far up, so what I want to do is bring it down. So if I take the balance up, I should get to a point where, you know, it's verging just towards the feet. This greyish down here will not be much of a blend, so it's not going to, you know, interfere too much. I could take the brightness up or down, and that will move it a bit further down, but it's becoming so dark that it's not really showing up. And I can increase my contrast, and that will bring it down a little bit, but not so. I don't want to bring it down so far that, you know, I've got no transition. Okay, so if we go back to our material view, you should now see that, you know, those have been sitting on the floor for a while and have really got kind of messed up. We can adjust this, of course. I take the roughness down a little bit so it's not quite so messed up, and you can adjust the colour so it's not quite so, you know, not quite so obvious. A lot of texturing, I think, is a bit of subtlety. Sometimes you have to be kind of you know, really hammer it home, but subtlety is good as well. So you needn't leave it at that. You can always go in here again and add a generator layer on top. We'll go for dirt, and you'll see that that's overriding our mask editor. So we'll set that to multiply, and now we've got some kind of dirt spots down the bottom, so it's not completely uniform. You know, completely uniform is, you know, it's the you know, the worst of all things, unless you're doing a really kind of low res, you know, a low res view. Okay, so I mean, that's essentially, you know, where I'm heading for. It's perfectly good texture. You know, it's perfectly great if you had a nice, you know, office scene or a, you know, waiting room or something where this chair would fit, and it's off in the side. It's going to look perfectly fine. But what we're going to do is, with a final really look at it, we're going to put a texture over everything to really kind of bring it together. So I will talk to you in the next section. Okay, so as I said, if this is where what you were looking to go for, this is where you're going for. But it's at this point, you know, we could take this in many different ways. So if I close up both these folders, you know, these are our layers at the moment. This is what's controlling our texture, and they're both going on specific parts. But we can put one that goes over everything. So if I had a fill layer, you'll see it goes over everything. And we can add a mask to this, of course, and we could either build a generator or use our own, or use a combination of all sorts of things to, you know, get where we're going. So I'm going to add a generator, and this time I'm going to add dripping, and you'll see that adds kind of a layer of dripping texture over everything. And the dripping one is quite useful actually. It uses curvature, ambient occlusion and position, and we can change various aspects of it. So if I take the rust spreading down and the contrast down a bit, I can kind of reduce where it's all going, and we can, whoops, increase the drip intensity so that they sort of drip a little further, or the smoothness. I quite like to get smoothness down a little bit, get a little bit of you know, movement in it. And then there's the samples. You'll see the samples, the less samples you've got, the rougher it is. So I'm going to leave that there. If your prop apps must be in a different direction, I could use a different channel to control where they're going. So this one looks a bit more wind blown, and blue is going upwards. So we'll stick with green. So this gives us the opportunity to put this over everything. And you know, we could sort of make this water damage. We could take the height off, metal opacity emission, so just the roughness, so everything's super rough on this layer. And we also have the opportunity to change the colour of, you know, our underlying pieces. So we don't just have to have this as normal. We could change this and have it as multiply. And you know, depending upon the colour, then it will depend upon what it's doing. And it's kind of difficult to see if you don't turn it off and on again. So if I turn it off, you'll see it makes a difference, and if I turn it back on again, you know, it's really making a difference. It's really kind of making everything, you know, unified. That's the word I'm looking for. So you don't have to stick at that. You can add more and more layers, or you can go in and add further layers underneath. You know, we could put rust on the metal, for example. So if I go back to the metal side, I can add a new layer, and to that layer, let's go to our materials, and there is a rust on here. Should have a couple. I'm going rust fine. See, of course it goes over everything, but for this one I'm just going to use a generator. So add black mask, add a generator. On our generator I'm going to use the metal edge, and there we've added some rust to our nice clean metal. There we go. So yes, you know, build your texture up so it looks nice, you know, almost new, out of the showroom, you know, however you like it. But then you can add additional layers to it to, you know, really make it fit for what you want, you know, because you may be putting it into a really messed up scene, or you may be putting it into it like a showroom, and whichever you're doing, you know, you kind of need to have a starting point, you know, and I always go with a kind of clean starting point and then mess it up afterwards. Okay, so I hope you found that useful, and yeah, I hope to talk to you again in another video set. So thank you very much, take care.